On behalf of the Program of African Studies at Northwestern University, it's my pleasure to introduce Medill School of Journalism professors Ava Thompson Greenwell and Douglas Foster. They're here today to discuss Ava's documentary about Chicago's Free South Africa movement, Mandela in Chicago, which premieres on WTTW this weekend. Northwestern is lucky to have them as professors in the Medill School of Journalism. Doug is a former editor of Mother Jones Magazine, a public television investigative reporter and correspondent, and a documentary producer himself. He writes about politics, global issues, and science for outlets such as The Atlantic, The Nation, The American Scholar, and the Los Angeles Times. He's the author of After Mandela, The Struggle for Freedom in Post-Apartheid South Africa. Ava, who has served as the school's Associate Dean and Department Chair, is the co-director of Medill's South Africa Journalism Residency Program. Her research interests focus on the intersection of race, gender, and journalism. She worked as a reporter at WFLA-TV Tampa, WCCO-TV in Minneapolis, WEH-TV in Indiana, and as a freelance correspondent at WTTW and WGN-TV in Chicago. Her book, Ladies Leading, The Black Women Who Control Television News, comes out in March. And now I'll leave Ava and Doug to discuss Ava's documentary, Mandela in Chicago.
Ava, we're speaking on the afternoon before the 31st anniversary of that historic day, February 11th, 1990, when Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela was released from prison after 27 years behind bars, and a transition to democracy in South Africa began. What's beautiful about this documentary is that it reminds us that decades before that moment, that day, there was a huge global movement, maybe akin to the movement against slavery more than a century earlier, that was in solidarity to the movement in South Africa. And much of that work in the US was led by African Americans, trade union leaders, the Black church, student activists. And one of those hubs was in Chicago. So I'm curious about how that movement resonated in your imagination growing up, and what brought you to this particular piece of work.
Doug, thank you so much. I think marking this anniversary, February is a very pivotal date, right? 1990, when Nelson Mandela is released. And here we are 31 years later, now talking about this documentary that really focuses on the way Chicagoans activated themselves. And so what motivated me initially was a prep course that I was teaching for Medill for students who were about to go off and work as reporters in Johannesburg and Cape Town. And so as you know, because you also co-direct the program, there's this required course that has to be taught. And I was new to all of this, knew very little about South Africa. But because of you and also Lauren Giglione, who also sort of brought the program to Northwestern, I was asked to become involved. And so I noticed that in the course, often you guys would bring in people from Chicago to talk about their experience in the anti-apartheid movement. And being a native of Chicago, I always remember this sign in front of Trinity United Church of Christ that said Free South Africa. Now at the time, I think I was in high school, so I wasn't quite sure what it meant, but that sign was really in my mind. And so this documentary has allowed me to combine that curiosity of what that sign really meant, as well as teaching this prep course and connecting with more Chicagoans. I mean, you know, once you connect with one or two, it just began to grow and grow and grow and grow. And before I knew it, I had interviewed 26 people approximately. Many of them were couples, you know, sort of working in this struggle together, you know. And so that what really motivated me was this idea that here I am, a native Chicagoan, hadn't lived in Chicago during the time at the height of this Free South Africa movement and didn't know a lot about it. So I was really curious and wanted to know more. And so that's what really started me working on this and thinking that, wow, this is a story I never knew. And if I don't tell this story now, then a lot will be lost. And for example, Doug, what's really sad about this is that I started working on this in 2016, and already 3 of the people featured in the documentary have passed away. And so that tells you that the urgency is now to allow people to tell their story the way they want it to be told, as opposed to what somebody else thinks the story will be later on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really an important moment, especially to capture those voices of people whose voices weren't amplified in some of the media that your documentary will now reach. I'd like to know what you were, so you started with this sense of wide open curiosity about what motivated the people to be involved in that way and what effect their actions had. What were the biggest surprises along the way? What were you not prepared to hear? What jumped out at you?
So there were a couple of stories, but one in particular was history itself. It just reminded me how little information and how little particularly Americans know about South Africa. So what really blew my mind was one of the persons I interviewed, and many of them were scholars in their own right. It's interesting that a lot of these activists, when they were younger, you know, they were learning themselves and they ended up teaching others. They ended up going into the university, the education field, interestingly enough, many of them did. So I call them scholar activists in the documentary. And so what really blew my mind is that one of the scholars, Cheryl Johnson Odom, she told this story about how African-American enslaved sailors were traveling to Cape Town, traveling across the ocean, way back in the early 1800s. And I thought, oh, I didn't know that. That was something that was new to me. And in fact, when I started digging, I found a scholar through Howard University who had written about this, had written about enslaved African-Americans who ended up in South Africa in the early 1900s. And they would travel, of course, by sea with their overseers, right? With those who had enslaved them. And what's interesting is I found a photograph of an African-American sailor with the enslaver that's in the documentary. And in addition to that, there's a song that they sing in South Africa talking about the Alabama, and they're talking about the ship, the Alabama. And so that really blew my mind. I think the other piece, again, historical, was the fact that we all have heard of the Fisk Jubilee Singers, where there were also the Hampton Jubilee Singers, another African-American historically Black college in the United States. They also toured South Africa. This is in the late 1890s and spent time there. And so I wasn't aware of this African-American influence early on in certainly the United States history. And that really was very surprising to me. But interestingly enough, about a year ago, I was having dinner with a friend in South Africa, and he knew this story. He knew the story of African-Americans who had traveled to Cape Town. And so I just found that fascinating that we know so little. You know, we know about Nelson Mandela. We know he was released. He spent 27 years in prison, but we don't really know a whole lot more than that. And so what I think is so important about this documentary, and what I hope will happen, is that it will reignite interest in both countries in terms of the equality work that still needs to be done, that still is unfinished. And so that historical piece, that's really what surprised me.
One of your sources tells you in the film, quote, Mandela was the teacher. He describes the power of hearing him speak here in 1993 when Mandela came to the city. We were all in his classroom, he says. Well, what do you think was underneath and behind that admiration? And what do you think the teaching was?
So the teaching was a reinforcement of this idea that you have this vast inequity, both in South Africa and in Chicago. I mean, a lot of these activists were much like your Black Power movement activists in the 60s in the United States, where they would hold, teach-ins, especially in California, teaching about what people needed to know to activate this energy inside of them. And so I think what he meant by that is, you get to be taught by the teacher who lived this, not just by somebody who read about it, but somebody who actually embodied it and experienced it. And that's what really made it powerful. I mean, one of the other comments in the documentary that was also very telling was Prexy Nesbitt, who you know as an activist who actually is in California now. And he said, you know, I was doing some going through my papers the other day, and I saw and noted that I had some 78 South Africans who stayed at my house here on the west side of Chicago. And so to say you had 78 different South Africans stay at your home over this period really says that you were really connected. But most importantly, what the activists felt was that they needed people to hear directly from South Africans about what apartheid was like, what it was like to be in a union, what it was like to be arrested because you just organized for something basic as a human right. And so this was really their strategy, is to bring these South Africans to Chicago so Chicagoans could actually engage with them one-on-one at various meetings. And I think that's really what motivated a lot of the people to get involved here in the Chicago area. And also they saw connections with the US apartheid system, right? And being able to see those connections meant, although they were 8,000 miles apart, we are really actually living some of the same racial inequalities.
And you also show us in the documentary how much appreciation Mandela expressed for the activity of these people thousands of miles away who had exercised leverage on his side in that long struggle. So you've been going to South Africa regularly for a while. Do you find any remainder of that sense of connection on that side?
Less so, I think. And I think, again, this is why my hope is that the documentary will really ignite not only interest, but particularly a new generation of young people who may not know that much about Chicago's role or any other city in the US, their role in helping to end apartheid. And vice versa. I think we have a generation of Chicagoans, Chicago school teachers, school children, high schoolers, you know, even college students who, yeah, they know, they heard about apartheid, but they're really not that sure. I think a lot of people think, oh, apartheid ended in 1994. It's done. We're over. Everything's good. And you and I both know, no, there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of the equity that needs to happen for Black people in South Africa and also Black people here in the United States. And so I think that commonality, my hope is that now they don't have to worry about getting on a plane and flying 8,000 miles to connect. All they have to do is turn on their computers, right? But then the bigger issue is, do they have a computer, right? Because we have load shedding, electrical problems in South Africa where people cannot always have continuous electricity or availability to it. We also know that poverty is still a major issue in South Africa. And so there are lots of people who can't afford a computer. And so those are the kind of inequities that I think we still need to be having conversations about. And I hope that this documentary will be able to ignite those conversations in new and different ways.
I was thinking about that ambition for the documentary, and I think it'll go a long way to helping people make those connections. We're living through an inward turning time. The pandemic, political turmoil here, a concern about police shootings, systemic racism, and the rest. And sometimes in those conditions, people turn inward and are unable to make these connections. But then I was thinking about the reality of life in the 1960s and 1970s, when these people who were trade union leaders or ministers or student organizers were equally pressed.
Absolutely.
Urgent things, and yet could manage to make the connection and then to act meaningful in a meaningful way in making the connection between social justice, racial justice here and there. So what is the lesson? You've spent time with this generation, and you've pointed out that many of them are elderly or recently passed. So what is that lesson about what ought to happen, even when we're very pressed to take care of what's happening right on the corner where I live, about not losing sight of this international global perspective?
Well, I think the lesson that we take from this is that it takes time to turn around these systems, right? These systems that we put in place. And when I say we, not me, but not you, but collectively, these oppressive systems that are in place are there, and they do the work that they're designed to do, and that is oppress. But I think we have to know that the work that is done is important, and that even if we're not able to see the fruits of our labor in our lifetime, hopefully at some point in the future, we will see the fruits of those, of our labor. I like to say that before the Black Lives Matter movement, there was the anti-apartheid movement that was really kind of sandwiched in between the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter. And what you see over time in terms of change of leadership, there's some gender changes, right? So in the civil rights movement, mostly men are out front. Women are kind of working behind the scenes. What was really unique about Chicago was some of the organizations, really like CITSA, the Coalition for Illinois Investment in South Africa, they wanted to make sure that there was always a man and a woman. So they would have co-leaders in those organizations. And then today we see that morphing into women, Black women in particular, really leading the Black Lives Matter movement and then having that spread all over the United States. So I think you can see that change over time, which is really what history is about, even when you're looking at those movements. And so I think that's an important thread that's there. And then the other thing I would say that's really interesting, and again, this is a tease, you'll have to watch the documentary on Sunday, is that Nelson Mandela, remember, came to the United States right after he was released from prison on February 11th, 1990. And so he came to the United States probably around June or July. I actually was a reporter in Tampa, and I remember they sent me to Atlanta to cover Nelson Mandela being in Atlanta. But what I didn't know at the time is that Nelson Mandela had skipped Chicago. So he didn't come to Chicago until 3 years later. And so if you watch the documentary, you'll find out why it took him 3 years to get to Chicago. And when he came, of course, he was not only here to thank the people, but he was also here to raise money for the ANC because there was going to be an election that following year. So, just as a reminder to people, the documentary airs Sunday, Valentine's Day, at 4 p.m., channel 11 WTTW. And I like to say this was a labor of love, so it's appropriate that it would air on Valentine's Day with emphasis on labor, because there certainly is a lot of labor in putting together a documentary, but also even within the documentary, as you pointed out earlier, labor unions are also highlighted pretty heavily in the documentary.
I think we're going to leave it right there with a tease, because those who have joined us have heard about the documentary, but there's nothing like seeing this remarkable work from you, Ava, and really grateful to our friends at the program of African Studies for bringing us together and allowing us to have a little bit of a conversation about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ava and Doug, for coming in and having this conversation. And I'll check out the documentary, and I hope many other people do this weekend, February 14th, WTTW at 4 p.m. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Good to be with you.